What is going on, everybody? It is a solo show with your host, producer Jay. It's one of those situations as has been happening recently where one of us does a solo show. Although this one was more voluntary because I felt bad that Brother Tay and Brother Jay had to do solo shows, and I thought I'd do one on my own. So before we get started, if you take a look at right there's our socials if you want to follow us on there. We normally do this at the end, but I figured let's do it at the beginning. Also, like and subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on podcast, rate us, share us, do all that jazz, so that way we can reach a broader audience, because that's ultimately what we want, and it's better for everybody. So anyway, this episode is gonna be more of I don't want to say it's gonna be like a rant or a grind my gears, because it's more of just discussing and breaking down the whole if you read the title, you already know what I'm going to talk about, but just breaking it down and talking about different aspects of it, about why certain things are the way they are and why people view things a certain way. It's going to be a little bit ranty, but I'll try to keep that to a minimum. But yeah, so if you read the title, if you've listened to the podcast, that I am the resident nerd of the podcasting crew. Although I think Brother Zay from Loading Up, shout out to Loading Up, you should definitely check that out, gaming podcast, that I host as well. He's also kind of a nerd too, so he would, actually I probably should have asked him to, no, I said I was going to do solo. I'm going to do solo. But he probably would have loved to join in this conversation too, because I'm sure he has a lot to say about it. But yeah, so I'm like a very nerdy person. And in particular, aside from video games, because I do host a video game podcast, I am very into Marvel, and I am also very into Star Wars. Coincidentally, they are both owned by Disney. It didn't plan it out that way because, I don't know. It just happened that way. But anyway. So, yeah, I'm very into Marvel. I love the MCU. I used to read a lot of comic books back in the day. I kind of fell off a little bit just because, life, how it is. But, yeah, so I got into Marvel. Actually, I got into the comics after I got into the MCU. The MCU, I kind of picked it up. I feel, did I see the first Iron Man in theaters? I honestly can't remember. I know I saw the first Avengers definitely in theaters. I may have seen all the other ones on TV. So I guess I wasn't lining up at the movie theater to see these movies in the beginning. So, but I did follow them. I did enjoy them, and I was looking forward to the Avengers when it first came out. So basically what I want to talk about is, the whole idea of the MCU and Star Wars, but we'll get to that on the second half, because I want to focus on Marvel right now, because that seems to be in the zeitgeist currently when it comes to the movies and the shows. They just released the Marvels. I went to see it over the weekend, and I was watching Loki, because that was on Disney Plus. That just came out, not just came out, but that has been airing. It just finished, actually. I thought they were both great. But anyway, so what I want to talk about is the whole idea that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is in shambles, because I know that's been the hot topic. If you follow the trends online and on Twitter and all social media, it's pretty common to see people hating on the MCU, and I get it. Trust me, I get it. There's a lot to criticize when it comes to the MCU and the missteps that they take and all the fumbles and the overhyping and all that stuff. I get it. Trust me. There are some things I do agree with. However, there was a recent article from, I think it was Variety, that basically tried to paint the picture that Marvel's best days are behind them and it's essentially all downhill. Now, I'm not going to bring up the article because a lot of it was, it read like a hit piece. Like they were purposely trying to mold the narrative to make people believe that, yeah, this is like Marvel or the MCU is essentially is dying. And that couldn't be further from the truth. But there's a lot of things that compound on top of each other that they try to paint it as this is evidence that the MCU is failing. And I mean, first of all, I don't agree at all. So I feel like I said, it was written in a way that it felt like they had a vendetta against Marvel. So I'm going to rewind it back because I feel like I need to, I guess, build it up. I don't know. I'm going to say build it up, but like start from the beginning. So when, like I said before, when Marvel started making, well, I don't want to say when Marvel started making, they made X-Men and Spider-Man and all that stuff. They made friggin' Fantastic Four back in like the 80s or maybe even earlier. I don't know. But they've been making movies for a while. But they were all very kind of disjointed. Like they were all in their own little pocket universe where they didn't really interact with each other. X-Men never interacted with Spider-Man. They never interacted with the Hulk and all that jazz. But it was around in 2008 that they released Iron Man with the goal of creating a universe that is similar to the comics where, when there's like different heroes from different comics interacting with each other, and they appear in each other's comics and help each other. They have team up comics, this and that. So yeah, obviously they wanted to try that with the movie franchises because, I mean, honestly, nothing like that had been done before. And ever since the MCU gained popularity, you see a lot of other studios now trying to kind of capture that magic, in a sense that they want to create their own universe. Like they want to create a bunch of movies that tie into each other, and then they can have a big crossover, or well, maybe I don't know about the crossover part, but the idea of things taking place within the same universe has kind of become a thing now. And it was thanks to the MCU for popularizing that. And so when starting with Iron Man, they basically set out the groundwork, and actually originally they were gonna tie Iron Man into X-Men, into Spider-Man, prior, and the original Hulk. Not the original Hulk, but the last Hulk movie that released before Iron Man. They were gonna tie it all together, and it was pitched as like a multi-studio collaborative effort that basically would have had so they had 20th Century Fox, that's who owned X-Men. Then they had Sony, and then I think it was Paramount who owned Hulk, I think. I can't remember. But basically it was like 3 huge studios, and Marvel was independent at the time. I don't think, did Disney buy Marvel? Or they bought it a little bit after Iron Man. I'm pretty sure they bought it like maybe after Iron Man 2. But yeah, at the time, Marvel was independent. So that's why they sold all the IPs to different studios, because they needed to make money, because there was a point in time where Marvel was going to go bankrupt. Anywho, so yeah, they created this idea of interweaving different heroes and storylines to kind of cross over with each other, starting with the Avengers. And they wanted it to be like, I don't know how far they planned. Like, I know they wanted to do the Avengers, and I guess that was kind of like the litmus test, like to see how can they accomplish it. Would it be successful? Can they bring it forward or whatever? And obviously, it was a massive success. Although they weren't able to get those studios to be on board, because no studio wants to work with other studios. They're trying to compete. They're competitors in the same space. So, which actually makes it unprecedented at the time, at least, that Sony would work with Marvel on Spider-Man movies going forward. But anyway, we'll get to that. So they had the idea to make the Avengers, and at the time when they were releasing, I mean, superhero movies have always been like kind of like popcorn flicks. So you just go to the movies, you don't got really anything to do. Let's go see a superhero movie. It's fun to watch. It's entertaining. A lot of boom, boom, pow, pew, pew, that kind of stuff. And it always seemed to deliver. Even the worst superhero movies, even that at the time. Because if you look back in the past, the X-Men movies were not that good. But a lot of people have nostalgia glasses when they look back at them. Even the Spider-Man movies weren't that great. I mean, a lot of people have a lot of love for Spider-Man 2, but in reality, like, don't really hold up that well, at least in my opinion. I mean, others might feel differently. They definitely will feel differently, because I know a lot of people think that Tobey Maguire is the best Spider-Man, but I'm not here to debate that. Where was I? Oh, so then, so yeah, they made the Avengers, and that was basically it. And it was very, like, I don't want to say niche, because these movies made a lot of money. So I want to say that they were pretty successful. And granted, like I said, the superhero movies at the time, they were always going to be like a go-to watch, like for a fun like Friday night or Saturday night, whatever. But to get, I think people really didn't understand like what the goal was. And because, like I said, this hadn't been done before, about making a multi-movie universe that ties into each other, leading up to a team-up movie. So a lot of people really didn't understand that, and it was pretty much like, if you didn't know what was going on, you would have thought, like, if you weren't paying attention to each movie, you would have been lost. Because if you go to the Avengers, it starts out with a story that stemmed from Thor, which was Loki, who came into Midgard, and he was taking over. So if you weren't paying attention to the movies leading up, even when or even on like Iron Man 2, like with Nick Fury showing up and basically talking about the Avengers initiative, like if you weren't paying attention, like you would be like, what is this? What is going on? I watched Iron Man 1. What is going on with Iron Man 2? Like, a lot of these movies are not well, I don't want to say they're not like sequels, because they are sequels, but like there's so much more to be learned from each movie, especially like with the Captain America stuff that were showing up in Iron Man 2, and it's like there was a lot of Easter eggs, put it that way, and it would go right over your head if you weren't paying attention. But so yeah, after the Avengers, I feel like a lot of people just kind of fell off. That they would just say, oh, they did the Avengers, they did the team-up movie, and that's it. Let's move on. But no, like, that was just phase 1, as they coined it. Phase 2 started, and they started introducing more. They started with Iron Man 3 and the Thor Dark World. Now, what's interesting about that is that a lot of people, especially today, they go on about how Marvel fell off, that it's not as good as it used to be, like what happened to the great writing and the storylines from the original phases and phase 2 and stuff like that. But they forget that right after Avengers, or the first Avengers movie, we had Iron Man 3 and Thor the Dark World, which was maybe Iron Man 3 is a little bit more divisive because like some people have fond memories from that, but personally, in hindsight, because I actually never seen Iron Man 3 in theaters. I actually never seen it. Seen it. Next year, I actually never saw it until I did a rewatch of the entire MCU. Like Iron Man 3 was the one I just happened to miss. For whatever reason, I just never saw it. I did see Thor: The Dark World. And that was very bad. Like I think people are very like I said, they look at it from a nostalgic perspective and they don't realize how bad that movie was. Even watching it now, it's very like I don't want to say it's tone deaf, but it's just like it felt like it was trying too hard. And it wasn't paying attention to what the other movies were doing that made it popular, and it seemed like they were trying to be too serious for the sake of being serious. And it hurt the product overall. And that, for me personally, I think Thor: The Dark World was the worst MCU movie or show or whatever, period. I just, it's that bad. And Iron Man 3 is not far off for me either. So, like, a lot of people forget that Phase 2 started with two rough MCU movies. And actually, let me look it up because I actually wrote it down. Because I was kind of plotting out a potential new rewatch of the MCU because like I said, I watched the Marvels this weekend, and I toyed with the idea of potentially letting my kids get into it, even though they're a little younger. But it would take a long time. Like literally, if I watched every Marvel movie and show and space it out for a movie a week and then give 2 weeks for like a TV show just to have time to watch each episode, it would take about a year. And that's just with the movies now. So imagine a year from now, like, well, granted, there's only one movie coming out next year. And I don't know about TV shows. But anyway, so we had Iron Man 3, then the Thor: Dark World, and then there was Captain America: Winter Soldier. Now, granted, that movie was very good, but it was preceded by two kind of iffy movies. And also, right after that was Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, in hindsight, we adore Guardians of the Galaxy. Like, that's a top of the line MCU property right now. And that's why Volume 3 did so well. But beforehand, it was kind of unknown. It was very obscure. Even in the comics, the Guardians had not been used, or maybe they had. I can't remember exactly like what was the issue with the Guardians exactly, but in the grand scheme of things, they were very obscure IPs to work with. So it was kind of up in the air on on if it was going to be successful or not. So they took a gamble and it paid off. And honestly, it kind of paved the way for the MCU going forward, because pretty much every MCU movie afterwards has a little bit of the Guardians of the Galaxy DNA in terms of the action mixed with comedy mixed with drama. Like, it was a perfect blend that basically laid the groundwork for what would be considered a great superhero movie. And any like deviation from it, it couldn't be hit or miss. But anyway, so what I'm trying to say is that, and even with Guardians being good, even with Captain America being good, Age of Ultron. Now, granted, it's not terrible, but of the Avengers movies, it's kind of it's the last one. Like, that's number 4. If you're listing them, that would be everybody's on number 4. Well, maybe somebody might put it over the first Avengers, depending on how they felt about it. But anyway, so Phase 2 overall, very like down. And then there was Ant-Man right after that, which was kind of like hit or miss. Some people liked it, some people didn't. Yeah, so it begs the question too, because like going through it, because I was already in it at that time. I was already deep in the MCU. I was watching every movie. Um, and I enjoyed it because I was a fan. I liked the movies because I liked the idea of these movies connecting with each other and basically being, because this was even before these movies came out, people called them superhero movies. I feel like now we've moved past that term, and now we've moved into what we call comic book movies, because a lot of times superhero movies are different. Like they have a certain structure, and they I feel like they were always like meant to be kind of dramatic with a little bit of comedy thrown in, and it was supposed to be like bombastic. Now, granted, that is all true, but I feel like it's less about the superheroes and more about their stories in particular. Because like Superman, like what they make movies of Superman, like they focus on his powers and stuff like that, and very rarely did they focus, at least leading up to the DCEU or whatever. Like it was less about his story and more about his powers and the villain and who's gonna win. Like, I mean, granted, you already know who's gonna win. Anyway, so during that phase 2 and even into phase 3, Marvel was not a popular brand, and I distinctly remember being kind of maybe not me personally, but the Marvel fandom was kind of made fun of pretty much, and we had to kind of endure because it wasn't a popular thing to be into. Comic book movies were not popular, which sounds odd given how successful each movie has been. But that was basically the dedication of the fan base. Like the larger audience of moviegoers were against Marvel movies, and even to this day, they're against Marvel movies. Now, granted, it's been like a kind of like a peaks and valleys and stuff, but for the most part, they were against it, and they didn't like the idea that these movies were kind of taking over the box office, where there was like 2, 3, 4 movies in a year, or maybe not in a year, but like there was like two blockbuster movies, and they were both Marvel movies, for like a given year, and a lot of other movies started to like move away from them because it was like, yo, these movies are gonna be taking up all the money pretty much. Like people are gonna go to the theaters to see these movies and not ours. So they kind of like had to spread out because of it, and it kind of led to a little bit of disdain from directors and writers and stuff like that. Even some actors, they refused to do Marvel movies or just superhero or comic book movies in general, because there's like a stigma attached to it. But anyway, so for a while, it was very unpopular to be a fan of the MCU. But then, somewhere along the line, during phase 3, a little movie called Black Panther came out. And I feel like, now I don't have any like data to like back this up or anything like that, but I feel like I noticed a trend. Now, granted, they had already advertised like Infinity War and stuff like that. Like there was already an uphill trend going for the MCU and going through phase 3. But I feel like for whatever reason, well, actually no, I know why, because Black Panther was kind of like what's the word I'm looking for? It was like a moment, I want to say, like where like like the Black community had something to grab onto that was theirs and that they can be proud of, and that was actually good. Like it wasn't like a cash grab. They did the character justice. It was a great message, and it was powerful. It was very powerful. Black Panther was very powerful, and it was somewhere around that time that people started to be like, okay, I'm on this bandwagon now. And ever since then, people started to, I don't want to say pretend. Actually, no, maybe it wasn't Black Panther. So, okay, there was also a little bit of, I guess, a spike in popularity during Civil War, which, let me see how far away that was. So it was at the beginning of Phase 3 was Civil War. Okay, so maybe it started there. But then ultimately when we got to Black Panther, that was like the pinnacle, I guess you could say. Because I remember when I heard about Spider-Man, because I wasn't really, I mean, I was going to watch him, but I wasn't really looking forward to any of the movies coming up. Because I think at the time when it was announced, the third Captain America movie wasn't Civil War. It was called Serpent Society or something like that. But then like I said before, the unprecedented happened, and Sony actually partnered with Marvel to make a Spider-Man movie in the MCU, which it was crazy, unheard of. How could this happen? Not even how could this happen, like how? Like how were they able to pull this off? But so yeah, so that kind of like piqued everybody's interest, and then they started paying attention. But I feel like it was leading up to Black Panther that kind of like ushered in the masses getting ready for Infinity War, because that was the big movie that people wanted to see. And I was excited too, obviously, because it was the culmination of a whole 3 phases of movies like tying into one. Every movie was going to be showcased in some way, and they were going to have characters interacting with each other. It was like a dream. And a lot of people bought into it too. A lot of people got into the idea of all these movies tying together into one event, or I guess 2, because when they announced it, it was initially Infinity War Part 1 and then Part 2. But that Part 2 ended up being Endgame later on. So a lot of people basically ended up becoming like a bandwagon fan. They saw the hype, they saw how popular things were getting, and they wanted in on it. Because it's natural for people to, because it's funny, if you ever, there's an experiment that somebody did, I forget where I saw it, but basically they just had like, I think it was like 5 people lining up on in front of like a store. I don't remember what store it was, but they were just lining up and talking and basically acting excited. And without even saying what they were online for, other people started coming on the line and waiting. They had no idea but they saw the excitement, and it was just like, I want that. Whatever they're getting, I want that. And that's essentially what happened with the MCU. They saw everybody's excitement for Infinity War, and they wanted in on it. So that's what basically helped make Infinity War and ultimately Endgame as well the most popular movies in the MCU. Endgame being, I think it's like, well, at one point it was the best or the highest grossing movie, or maybe, the highest grossing movie of all time. Now, granted, Avatar kind of pushed it out of the water again, no pun intended. So Infinity War, there was a lot of people who got into it right before Infinity War, and they thought, this is what I like. This is what comic book movies should be every single time. And that was where the issues started to happen, because once Infinity War happened, then right in between was Ant-Man and the Wasp, which didn't do so well, and it wasn't as popular, naturally, because people were just like, whoa, what happened? I was expecting Infinity War levels of like hype and bombastic and whatever. It didn't do that. It was a good movie. I still liked it, but it didn't do that. Anyway, then it was Captain Marvel. Now, Captain Marvel had his own issues, mostly stemming from like the whole Brie Larson situation. I'm not gonna really get into that aspect because that's a whole nother can of worms I really don't want to get into. She's very outspoken, and not a lot of people like that. But anyway, so they were a lot of people. I mean, granted, the movie did do well, but I think it was because it was right before Endgame that people kind of like they bought into the idea that she was gonna be a big part in Endgame, which she really wasn't, if you want to be honest. But she did play a major role in the end and in the beginning, I guess. But really, in the middle, didn't really do anything. She was gone. But so yeah, so then Endgame happened, and it was like a freaking a whirlwind of just build up and suspense and anticipation. Excuse me. And it was just like it was like a fever dream where there was so many things happening, and it was emotional, and it was the culmination of 10 years of Marvel, like starting with Iron Man. Like you had every single hero on screen at the same time fighting in a huge battle, and it was such an awesome moment. I to this day I still wish I can like relive that, and hopefully with Secret Wars they end up doing it as well, or like kind of like recapturing that, because Secret Wars is gonna be good. I'm telling you, if it's anything like the comics version, because I didn't read the whole thing, I read some of it, but if it's anything like the comics, it's gonna be very interesting, I'll say that. But so yeah, Endgame happened, and then it was kind of like a lot of people felt like it was the ending, like that was it. Tony Stark sacrificed himself and yada yada yada, like, and then the epilogue was kind of like Spider-Man Far From Home. That was like dealing with the aftermath of Endgame. And then after that, people kind of were okay with moving on from the MCU, but a lot of people weren't, because we knew this was going to continue. They hadn't even bring in the X-Men. They didn't even bring in Fantastic Four, and Marvel or Disney just bought Fox to bring in the Fantastic Four. So it was like and X-Men and mutants and all that stuff. So it was like, you can't end it there. Like, you gotta keep going. You gotta bring them in. There was so many more stories to tell. But then the pandemic happened, and we had to wait a whole year in order to get something new. Actually, it was like a year and a half, because after Far From Home, there was, let me see. Yeah, no, it was like a year and a half. So yeah, after Far From Home, the rest of the year was nothing, and then the pandemic hit. There was supposed to be a bunch of stuff coming out, I think, like Black Widow and the Disney Plus shows, because Disney Plus just came out like a year, not a year before. Wasn't it a year before? Or maybe it was the same year. I can't remember. Or a year after. I don't know. But they had a bunch of planned shows that they wanted to air, but they couldn't, because the scheduling shifted, and there was shutdowns, and they couldn't film, and it was a lot. So then they pushed everything back a year, and then people kind of like fell off. And granted, they came back when WandaVision aired, and it was like back again. Like, WandaVision actually very good. And then slowly things started to come out that weren't that great. They had the Falcon and Winter Soldier, which was okay, but it was like, okay. I think a lot of the issue was that people weren't ready for shows when it comes to the MCU, and there was no like framework. It was just kind of like they were doing it for the first time, figuring things out. The WandaVision was like 9 episodes, then Falcon's Winter Soldier 6 episodes, then Loki was 6 episodes, and then What If came out. That was like a like 9 episode or 8, or I don't remember. But then Black Widow happened, and that was kind of like the first sign that, like, oh, things are not that great anymore. Or not anymore, but they weren't as great as they wanted it to be. And then the same thing with the Eternals. Shang-Chi was actually very good. That was more of an experiment that paid off, because that was probably the most action-y of the MCU movies in terms of like pure like choreographed fighting and stuff like that. It was like a like an old school kung fu movie type movie or film, whatever. Yeah. So then, yeah, after that we got Hawkeye, which is hit or miss to some people. I enjoyed it, but then a lot of people came back for like No Way Home. So like basically, there was just a lot of scatter. There was some good, some bad, but a lot of people wanted everything to be as good as Infinity War and Endgame because they thought like that Marvel can't fail anymore. They have the formula. They know it works. So there's good. We're eating good now. But then they realize that like, okay, there's certain things that aren't going to be good. But this is exactly what happened in phase 2. There was some things that weren't so good, but it was still like decent. Like it still built up to something that was good. So that's why like my whole not concern, but my gripe with these fans is that not everything is going to be like super spectacular great. And that's okay. Not everything has to be that. And if you go into these movies taking it for what it is and not what you want it to be, then you're going to have a better time with it. Because I feel like that's the problem a lot of people have, is that they want it to be something that it's not. And this, honestly, this is even the same for like comic books. Not every comic book is great. Sometimes there's missteps. Sometimes there's boring comics. Sometimes there's great ones. Like it's not all cookie cutter. And that's what I have the issue with, is that people want cookie cutter. They want the same thing every single time. They want crossover. And then it also doesn't help that there's also people who don't want that. And it's like, it's always the vocal minority. I get that. But, yeah. So what sparked this too also is the build up to like the Marvels and stuff like that. Now, granted, there was the strikes, which just ended, that they played a factor into like the advertising for this movie. But it did, at least financially, didn't do so great, at least for the first weekend. When I went to see it with my kids and my fiance, we basically had the theater to ourselves. Like there was like maybe a few other people there too, but ultimately like the theater was empty, and it was actually very jarring because like usually for a Marvel movie you see a lot, like a decent amount of people there, but on a Friday night, because that's when we went for a Marvel movie, that's crazy. But the movie was actually very entertaining. Like the thing, again, when you go into a movie, you can't expect it to be like what you have in your head. Like granted, you have expectations, that's fine. But if you're going into it expecting it to be like Endgame, like Infinity War, like whatever more Marvel Guardians that just came out a few months ago, like that's that movie. And it's okay to admit that a movie is not for you. And I think that that's why it frustrates me, because people are so afraid of just saying something is not for them. They want people to agree with their opinion and they go online and spew all this nonsense and seek validation because they want to feel good about themselves. They want to feel good about their opinions. And that's fine. That's their prerogative. But they need to realize that their opinions are not the end all be all. And it's also hypocritical because we'll see people getting hyped like for Guardians and for Loki and say, oh, Marvel's back. And then we'll get like a Secret Invasion. It's like, oh, Marvel fell off. They're the worst. I'm never going to watch an MCU movie again until the next one, so they can complain about it or praise it as the greatest thing since sliced bread. But yeah, it's just the inconsistency. And I get it. There's a lot of people online. Not everybody has the same opinion, but I do see the same. It feels like a freaking script at this point that people read from, where they say the same exact thing and it's so annoying. But regardless, the MCU is not in shambles. MCU is fine. It's just some things are not going to be for you. Some things will, but that's okay. It is what I'm ultimately saying. Like, it's okay to not like certain things. It's okay to admit it's not for you. That's it. Anyway. Now, I spent majority talking about the MCU. I was supposed to talk about Star Wars. I still can. So, the Star Wars aspect of things. So, full disclosure, I relatively recently got into Star Wars, like within the past couple years. It was actually because when I first like heard about but like growing up, I heard about Star Wars all the time. I've always wanted to get into it, but for whatever reason, I convinced myself that it was too much. It was overwhelming. Like, there was just too much content for me to consume. I might get confused, or I might not get into it because they're so old movies and this and that. I always like told myself like that's why I didn't get into it. When in hindsight, if you look at how many freaking MCU movies and shows we have, like, it's actually easier to get into Star Wars than it is for Marvel, because Marvel is actually it that's not the source material. The source material is the comics. With Starfield, I'm getting mixed up. I'm thinking I'm a gaming podcast. Star Wars, the source material is the movies. Like, the movies were the original work, so they built from there, from the original trilogy. Anyway, so I was always like, I don't know, I wasn't disinterested. I wanted to get into it. I don't know. I can't think of the word right now, but I always avoided it because I thought it was going to be too much for me to get into. But it was actually a few years ago when my now fiance, she was my girlfriend at the time, she was watching Clone Wars. Now, I think it was like one of her coworkers or one of her friends had recommended it to her, and she started watching it. And I that was also part of the reason too, because I really didn't want to watch Clone Wars because it was such a long show. And she was watching it, and I just so happened to be watching it with her one time, and I was like, oh, it was actually pretty good for a cartoon. That was actually decent. Like, I was actually into the storyline. It was like a quick, like 1 or 2 episode storyline that they usually do, and that was enough for me to be like, okay, maybe I can give it a shot. If all the other stuff are even remotely similar to this, I could get into it. Now, granted, there were times that I did watch the movies, but it didn't really stick with me. Like, for whatever reason, I just couldn't. I couldn't take in everything that was being shown to me. Like, I knew the basics, like Luke Skywalker, Darth Vader, that stuff. But for whatever reason, I couldn't take in like the details of what the story was about and the like why they were on Tatooine and all that stuff. Like, it wasn't registering with me. Like, I was watching it, and it was like in one ear out the other for whatever reason. But it was after I watched Clone Wars, those episodes, that I was like, okay, maybe I can get into it. So then I started again, but this time I focused more on like the story, because it had been years at that point before when I tried to watch it originally, and it wasn't registering. But then the second time that I tried, maybe it was just the idea that I knew it was attached to Clone Wars, that I thought, okay, let me actually try and pay attention. So when I was watching Clone Wars, it was kind of like did I skip a few episodes? I can't remember. Maybe I wanted to in the beginning, because some of the beginning episodes are kind of like slow and rough and stuff like that. But as the seasons moved on, and I started watching it with my fiance as well, um something just like clicked, and I was just like, okay, like I'm starting to grasp the story, and like like where things were, like who like what was going on essentially. And that, for whatever reason, like made me more into it. And I can't really explain it. It's such a weird thing. And I just started understanding stuff. I started paying attention to small details, and getting the bigger scope of it. And I also do admit that it was because at the time that I started getting into it, they just started releasing like the Mandalorian show, and there was talk, I think at the time, maybe they had just announced a Book of Boba Fett. So like I knew there was more content coming, because I know for a long time there was like basically a Star Wars drought, and there was like nothing for years. I think it was like over a decade where there was just nothing, and it was hard to be a Star Wars fan, because if you have nothing to consume, like how can you, I mean, granted, people are fans of older stuff, but it's like it's hard to get into at that time when there's nothing new. So to compare it to, and to like look forward to, maybe that's for me, or that's a me thing rather. But anyway, so yeah, so I started watching, and I started getting into it, and then up until we got to like the Mandalorian, I was like, this is great, like this is really good. And I started seeing a lot of, well, so for the Mandalorian, I feel like the first season was like widely praised. Then I think did season 2 happen first? I can't remember. Oh, maybe it was Book of Boba Fett. I don't know. But it was more like when the shows started coming out more frequently, there was Andor, and granted, Andor was good too. There was a lot of, well, so sorry, let me cut to the chase, 'cause I feel like I'm building up, and like I'm just describing my history with Star Wars, whatever. The issue that I have with Star Wars, it's not necessarily Star Wars. I mean, granted, this is the same thing with Marvel. Like the fans, it's similar, but it's also very different. So with Marvel, people want it to be like the old days. And with Star Wars, it's similar in that people want it to be like the old Star Wars. However, I feel like this one with Star Wars is more segmented. So there's the original trilogy fans, which is A New Hope, Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. Those are like the three like holy trinity that a lot of people just like swear by. That's the best. Nothing can get better. Then you had the prequel trilogy, which was Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, and Revenge of the Sith. When I was young when those movies, the prequels came out, and those movies were completely shat on by like the OG trilogy fans, because they felt like it was boring, it was too political, it was a lot of like exposition, there was not enough action. So it was, at the time when it was released, it was maybe not from like a review perspective, but from a fan base perspective, it was people who hated those movies. They thought that it was the worst thing ever to the franchise. It not deteriorated. It destroyed the goodwill that the original trilogy had, because a lot of people to this day believe that the OG trilogy is like the perfect trilogy, which is not true. I know I'm gonna get a lot of flack for that, but I feel I don't think it's perfect. I think there's a lot of flaws in it. Granted, a lot of it has to do with its age. I'm looking at it from a more contemporary mindset and viewpoint. So obviously, I'm gonna be a little bit more critical on the stuff that didn't age well. A lot of people are nostalgic for it, so they're gonna feel some way about it, that they're just gonna feel that way. They grew up with it, so it's gonna be the way it is. But anyway, then when Disney bought Star Wars, they announced that they were making a new trilogy, and a lot of people were kind of like iffy about it. They were just like, okay, there's a chance to restart, right the wrongs that the prequel trilogy did, quote unquote, and basically start fresh. Now that first movie, which was Rise of the Skywalker, I think it was, or hold on, let me look it up. I don't want to be wrong, because it's been a while since I watched them, and I'm to be fair, I'm not a fan. I'm not a huge fan of the sequel trilogy of Star Wars. Let me see. It was Force Awakens. Rise of the Skywalker was the last one. So yeah, The Force Awakens, I thought it was actually decent. I thought it was a good entry point for like people who weren't necessarily like super into Star Wars but wanted to get into it. It was like a good balance or whatever, and they paid homage to like old school fans, and it was basically like they tried to get the OG trilogy fans back. That's what I feel like they were trying to do, and they semi-succeeded, because they basically hit all the points where would have got them interested. But then it kind of took a downturn with The Last Jedi, and people started to basically shit on the whole thing because of the way they portrayed Luke, and there was a lot of that basically they felt like they walked all over the original trilogy and everything that it stood for in terms of like the story and like what the Jedi is supposed to be and all that stuff. I can see that. I see why people didn't like it. At the same time, I think it was just people, again, they had in their minds of what it was supposed to be, and they wanted it to be that, and it wasn't that, so they were upset. And I mean, that's just how it is sometimes. I mean, to be fair, Mark Hamill, the guy who plays Luke Skywalker, he also was very critical of the way they portrayed Luke, because he, of all people, you would think he knows, right? So if he says something that's like, hey, I don't think that's good, maybe you should listen. I don't know. And then they had the Rise of Skywalker, which I feel like a lot of people hated, because it was basically shoving everybody's, or they were shoving Rey in everybody's face when they didn't really want her. They wanted oh shoot, I'm forgetting his name. Shoot, let me look up the other guy, the one who was the stormtrooper. It's gonna bother me. Not Poe. I can't remember. It's bugging me. I don't want to spend my time looking at it, because let me just look it up. Oh man, it's gonna bother me, so I have to look it up. Let me see real quick. Finn, there we go. That's what it was. Finn. They teased Finn being a Jedi, or being a Force wielder or whatever. And they didn't like that they pivoted away from that and they focused on Rey. So anyway, so that was, people didn't like the sequel trilogy. So, but the thing is, ever since then, so how do I like transition this? So ever since then, basically, Star Wars was handed to, so all right, with Marvel they have like Kevin Feige, who's like in charge of everything related to Marvel and the MCU and stuff like that. He's like the head honcho. They essentially kind of wanted something similar for Star Wars, to basically have somebody that's in charge to make sure that everything works and that there's like a cohesive storyline going forward, because now they started to do the Disney Plus shows, and if they were going to do that, they needed to make sure like everything worked, So they gave it at first they gave it to Jon Favreau, which he like wrote and directed of the Mandalorian. But they also gave it to Dave Filoni. Now, what's significant about that is that Dave Filoni, he created Clone Wars. He also created Rebels, which a lot of people didn't watch, which if you didn't, you probably should, because a lot of the stuff that's going to happen going forward is important to watch that show. So he created those two shows, and those were like cartoons, and a lot of people didn't watch them, or they didn't watch all of it. And now you have people who are, they're either they're excited because now that Dave Filoni is in charge and Jon Favreau, they're kind of like working together. They're referencing stuff that happened in Clone Wars, because the thing with Clone Wars is that Clone Wars was initially not canon to the Star Wars story, because for whatever reason they just didn't want it to be. They wanted it to be its own thing, like it was a side thing that you really didn't have to watch. It was just extra. But then when Disney bought Star Wars, they decided to make it canon. So now everything that's happening now, going into like the next like Disney Plus shows and stuff like Mandalorian and even Ahsoka, and all this stuff that's happening now within Star Wars is referential to Clone Wars and Rebels. So there's a lot of people that are very upset about that, because they want basically what the sequel trilogy was supposed to be, which is like a refresh and basically building off of the OG trilogy. And you can do that, but it's hard to explain, because like the OG trilogy fans only like things that are related to the OG trilogy. If it has nothing to do with it, they don't give a shit. And that's the problem. So that's why they hated so much the sequel trilogy, because they were trying to reference it, but they were doing it in a way that they didn't like, so it made it even worse in that regard. And then the prequels, they didn't even bother with that. I mean, maybe they tried and maybe they tried to get into it, but it just wasn't working, and they didn't like it. So that's why I say like the fan base is segmented. You have the OG trilogy fans, prequel fans, sequel. Well, I feel like now you're starting to see sequel fans, because enough time has passed where the people who saw those movies were young, and now they're starting to grow up and being like, hey, like I liked that movie when I saw it when I was little. So it's like it's gonna be very odd to see those people now, because like they hated those movies. Anyway, but there was also like a fourth, which was like the Clone Wars fans, and I feel like now the Clone Wars fans are starting to like see the fruits of being into that stuff. Like now, like with Ahsoka, like that show is strictly like Clone Wars and Rebels referential. Like and it was actually very good as well. Ahsoka from Clone Wars, like she wasn't initially not even canon. Now they brought her to live action, and they're continuing her story. Mandalorian is based off of, I mean, granted, Boba Fett was a Mandalorian, or he was Mandalorian. So that was like the only thing that tied to like that Mandalorian culture. But Clone Wars expanded on it and gave like a whole backstory about like Mandalore and like the different tribes and all that stuff. And now we saw like in the Mandalorian show that we saw that play out, and it was just it's people within like the Star Wars community, they want what they want, and that's it. Like, they don't care about expanding, they don't care about watching other stuff. And it's so, like, anything that doesn't have to do with the OG trilogy, like, people are just not gonna like. Like, that's the issue right now with Star Wars. And granted, that fan base is getting older, so they're becoming less and less vocal. I hate to be like morbid about it, but it's the truth. So now the younger audience that grew up with, because even when was it Hayden Christensen, who played Anakin in the prequels, he came back for the Obi-Wan show, and he also came back for Ahsoka. And now he's starting, because remember I said, like, people hated those movies. Like, they were like, they didn't even bother with them. They were talking shit, and it was whatever. But now that he came back, people are giving him his flowers, essentially, because the audience that grew up with that and watched those as kids are now able to appreciate it even more now that they're referencing back to it. So basically, like, the problem is with the segmentation of the fan base that's causing the issues. And I feel like you can't, like, segment yourself to just that one thing. Like, if you're either a Star Wars fan through and through, like, with everything, or you're not. Like, I feel like you can't really pick and choose and say, look, oh, I just like the OG trilogy. Oh, I just like the prequels. Oh, I like the sequels. Oh, I like the Clone Wars. Like, it's all encompassing. You have to take everything, the good and the bad, whatever it is. You have to take it all, because, like, that's how you move forward. Like, that's how you're able to be entertained and enjoy these new shows and movies that are coming out, because and I'm not saying like you have to watch everything, but it's like, if you want the best experience and you don't want to feel like you're being left out, or that you're not being acknowledged or recognized, like, you kind of have to, like, broaden your horizons, essentially. Don't stick to one segment of the Star Wars lore or whatever. Like, you gotta take everything together. And ultimately, that's actually, you could say the same thing about Marvel. Like, you can't just pick and choose what you want to watch and stuff like that, because that was also an issue too. Like, with the Marvels, that people were saying, oh, everybody's gonna be confused because people didn't watch Miss Marvel on Disney Plus. They didn't watch WandaVision, where Monica Rambeau showed up. So it's like, yeah, and it's just like, if you didn't watch it, that's on you. Like, you gotta take everything. Like, either you're gonna watch everything or you're not, and you're gonna be confused. Like, that's on you. That's your choice. But ultimately, when it comes down to it, for both of these properties or whatever, I feel like people need to be a little bit more reasonable and not be so hostile towards the property itself, because I feel like that's ultimately what it is, that people, they're hostile towards Marvel and the MCU, and they're hostile towards Star Wars, and I feel like that's not the approach you should be. And they're hostile towards other fans that actually are enjoying it. Like, that's the thing that didn't make sense to me, that people are getting upset that other people are enjoying stuff. Like, how does that make sense? Like, they're literally in having fun. They're in a better position than you are, because you're being upset and they're happy. So it's like, who's really better off in this situation? But anyway, yeah, honestly, I could keep going, because, like, there's a lot more that I could say about it. But we're already over an hour, so I'm not trying to stick around any longer. But I do want to say one thing. I do have a grind my gears. I was gonna save this, and granted, I could technically save it, but I feel like I'm gonna forget. So people, I live in New York. I'm pretty sure you know that, if you've paid attention to these episodes. And I commute to work. I take the train, and it's hit or miss. that's not what I'm complaining about. When you exit the train and you're going up the stairs, a lot of times, for reasons unknown to me, because everybody, if you live in New York, you know that everybody's in a rush in the morning. So if you're leaving the train station, knowing that everybody is like trying to get to work, whether they're running late or they're trying to get their coffee, whatever the case may be, do not move at a snail's pace, because that is the most infuriating thing that can happen when you're exiting the train, that people are like either looking up or looking down at their phone or just like walking around like they don't know where they're going. Like, please, if you're gonna do that, get the hell out of the way, because it's so annoying when I'm leaving the train station and people are just walking around like they don't know where they're at. Granted, they could be tourists, but if you're a tourist in New York, don't be in the street at 8 a.m. because that is rush hour and that's when people need to get to work, okay? Plan things out for later in the day when people are at work and you don't have to worry about them. But yeah, I feel like in the morning from, I want to say like 7 a.m. to like maybe 9:30, if you're within a 1 block radius of a train station, please pick up the pace, because it's very annoying to walk behind people who just don't have a care in the world and are just like strolling through the street like it's a freaking movie. No, this is real life. People got to go to work. Move your ass. Okay? So anyway, that's going to do it for me. Like and subscribe if you haven't already. Leave a comment. We will get to you if we see it. Also, you can hit us up on Instagram. You can see it right there. Excuse _me_brother with A, because it's not racist. That's what they like to say. TikTok, excuse me brother, because it is racist. And Facebook, excuse me brother, because it also is racist apparently. That's it. Hopefully we'll be back next week with a full house, and we'll see you then. Peace.